So, in my chronological sequence of label arrivals here, we're up moving on to part two, which would really be 49 to 52, where there's a whole bunch of new labels that show up on the scene now in the 10-inch era. And then in the next episode, we'll talk 53 to 55 or 6 when there's a whole bunch of other labels again that show up. Right now, we're going to talk the early couple years of the 50s, 49. We're seeing the 78 era come to an end. The technology of the LP 33 and a third is kind of coming on the scene. Capitol, RCA, Columbia are kind of pushing this new technology. Some new labels kind of spring up to kind of capitalize on that new technology, new longer format. It allowed sessions to be more extended. You weren't just going to record a couple songs, put them on a 78. It was now you could record 6-8 songs, put them on a 10-inch LP. So it does lead to a changing transition in how sessions were recorded, which is only magnified more by 54, 55 when the 12-inch LP comes along. But it's a time of great flux and great change in jazz. Bebop has been percolating underneath the surface now for a good 5-6 years, but it's starting to hit record stores in a much more proficient way. We saw what Savoy and Keynote had done. My friend Scott Baldwin mentioned the Black and White label, which had quite a few great artists as well. I don't have anything on that label. There's not a 10-inch collection that I've seen. Most of it's from 78s. There has been some kind of budget LP collections put out over the years, but there's packaged so poorly. I've kind of passed them up because I hate the covers, and I need to get some black and white coverage. And they definitely had a big discography with a lot of artists. The artists as leaders isn't as great as just the body of artists who recorded an assignment on black and white, but there is certainly some pronounced names within that body of artists and sidemen. And another important label of the 40s would have been Black and White. So I appreciate Scott for mentioning that to me. I kind of knew he would because we've talked about the label a few times. And again, every time I've gone to invest into it, I don't find 10-inch material from them like I do for Commodore or some of the other labels. I don't find a lot of the great artists, when I have their discographies printed out in my binders, you don't see black and white sessions listed for some reason. And I don't know why that is, because there's certainly a lot of great names that were on black and white over the years, but they definitely deserve a mention here. I do want to also mention that in the late 40s into the 50s, the Stan Kenton Orchestra, the Woody Herman Orchestra were very large proponents of what jazz was about, especially in the white community. You had other guys like Claude Thornhill, another guy who had a large group. The Basie Ellington groups were still kind of doing their things going into the 40s and 50s, but again, that was being diminished. But definitely Kenton and Herman were huge proponents of a lot of the sales of jazz in the white community on the bigger labels. And a lot of them musicians in those bands were the ones making records on the smaller labels in the white community, on the white labels, having pretty good success and driving the sales and winning the Playboy and Downbeat Readers polls. And a lot of those names were slipped into obscurity. The labels that were taking the risk and recording the more black artists probably weren't making the revenue. Well, they definitely weren't making the revenue. But in posterity and down the road, they've left a greater legacy because those artists certainly were more pronounced. The first label we're going to talk about today is Prestige, and they run somewhat parallel to Blue Note in New York. We talked about Blue Note at the end of last episode. So if you haven't seen that, go back and watch that episode where we discussed the labels of the mid to late 40s. And Blue Note, of course, isn't really hit its stride in terms of what Blue Note becomes. But in 50, 51, they record some Thelonious Monk, they record some Miles Davis, and it starts to percolate the new modern sound that's starting to happen in Black America in the jazz community. And Bob Weinstock, who founds Prestige in 49, he also records early Miles and early Sonny Rollins and early Thelonious Monk. And he also records a lot of white artists like Jerry Mulligan and Stan Getz and J.J. Johnson. So the body of work at Prestige in the early 50s is actually more impressive than what Blue Note does in the early 50s. Blue Note's still doing a lot of that 7,000 sequence, Sidney Bechet, George Lewis, Dixieland, Boogie Woogie stuff. Weinstock has his pulse a little bit more, it feels like, on what's happening in the black community underground in New York. And Weinstock certainly is tapping into the modernity right off the bat. And initially, there is some 78 RPM stuff at Prestige, but label's initially called New Jazz, but then he rechristens it Prestige. But then he brings back the New Jazz sequence in '57 for the more out of the bounds stuff that he starts to record in that point. And of course, he also issues the Prestige Swingville and Moodsville sequence labels, which are both fantastic labels, kind of documenting older cats like the Coleman Hawkins. And anyone that Norman Granz hadn't swept up from that era, Bob Weinstock kind of gets them for those Swingsville and Moodsville records. So if you want a great idea of what the swing era cats were doing in the early to mid 50s to late 50s, Clef coupled with Swingville and Moodsville will really give you a great coverage of all that stuff. But we're going to dive into some 10-inch material here from Prestige. And you can see this New Jazz title, number 101. I think it might be the first one. You have young Lee Konitz, fantastic player, I think out of New York, and Lenny Tristano, who was quite an early avant-gardist in some ways. I had an approach to playing that was very much his own. The great Billy Bauer shows up on guitar on that, along with Lee Konitz on Lenny Tristano, Arnold Fishkin, and Shelly Mann on drums. Fantastic East Coast drummer who's known more for his West Coast playing down the road. And on the other session with Konitz, you have Warren Marsh, fantastic tenor player, Sal Moska on the piano, Arnold Fishkin and Denzel Bass, a great drummer. So that's the label that New Jazz Prestige kind of launches at first. And then they kind of follow that up with Stan Getz number 102. So you can see the graphic design here is more replicating the 78 RPM era still. The innovations of what Bethlehem's going to do by 53, what we'll talk about in the next episode, and what you see David Stone Martin starting to do for Clef. I mean, that's starting to take shape now by 49, 50, 51 at Clef on the 78 box sets and some of the 10 inches that they're putting up for the Jazz at the Philharmonica. But Weinstock hasn't got on that bandwagon at all, not yet. The Getz sessions here have multiple different players. The great Alan Eager, Brew Moore, another fantastic player who gets some sessions at Prestige, Al Cohn. A lot of these guys are going to be alumni of the aforementioned Woody Herman, Stan Kenton groups. Zoot Sims, again, these guys are from the Herman Herds. Walter Bishop on the piano, Gene Ramey, and Charlie Perry on the drums. The other session has Stan Levy, a young Philly drummer who was fantastic and left jazz at a pretty young age, with Getz, Gene Ramey, and Al Haig on the piano, a young bebopper piano player. Tony Ailes also shows up on some tracks with Percy Heath and Don Lamont. So, pretty good documentation of mixed bands racially, modern, progressive. Getz was kind of a young up-and-comer at this point. And so Weinstock's kind of at the cutting edge of what's happening way before Blue Note was. This is Chubby Jackson, fantastic bass player. I think he was out of the Chicago area, if I remember. And you have Howard McGee on some of these sessions, Al Porcino, Kai Winding, J.J. Johnson, Georgie Auld, the fantastic tenor player who's a great player. Zoot Sims, Charlie Kennedy, another great player that you don't hear much from. Jerry Mulligan shows up on the baritone here. Tony Ailes, Chubby Jackson, and Don Lamond on the rhythm section. And so it's really a fantastic Chubby Jackson all-star band. And Chubby plays bass in a lot of the great swing bands in the white community. And here he is playing with a great all-star band. But this is not really a swing group. It's more of a bit of a more modern post-swing approach to a bigger ensemble with those 4 sax players, 2 bone players, 3 trumpet players. There's certainly elements of swing still in this, but this was a more modern take, and that's number New Jazz 105. And by this time, I think he moves on to the Prestige label. And this is Roy Eldridge 114. So you can see it's the same sequence, that 100 sequence. And Roy Aldridge, of course, also was working at Clef for Norman Granz. Doesn't list the band, but now we have that blue label Prestige logo. We're probably talking 52 on that. So you once again you see a real mix of race, a real mix of modernity. Weinstock definitely has a kind of finger on the pulse. This is number 119. The new sounds from Sweden, and you have a lot of Swedish modernity happening, and the names are like Rolf Eriksson, who actually has a session at Emercy later, Aki Persson, Arne Domnerus, Carl Henrik Monorin, Lars Gulen, a fantastic baritone player, the Daring Young Swedes on the Flying Trapeze. It's pianos Bent Hallberg, who I think gets the lead. Leonard Feather helps promote this session. I think he might have brought these guys over. Rolf Berg, Simon Brem, Jack Noren. Some great songs, some great players. Certainly, and I actually have 2 copies of that for some reason. Sometimes I buy stuff from sellers and just kind of fill a card up with stuff's cheap. Then you have Gene Ammons here, number 127. And Ammons, this is well before his stint in jail in the mid to late 50s. Ammons, the Jug, battles Sonny Stitt. And a lot of the stuff actually will get repackaged on LP post 55 when they start the 7000 sequence. But Ammons here is a very young, up and coming, and he's always had a bit of that blues, Chicago swing, elements of the jump blues that's starting to happen with guys like Louis Jordan, Bull Moose Jackson. Ammons is kind of a crossover guy with lots of rhythm and blues in him, Black Church in him. Ammons is a fantastic player. And his arrest and time in jail was a real loss for jazz. So now we're moving on to 139, Billy Taylor. Now we have a photograph, but still primitive graphics. Certainly not what David Son Martin was doing, and we're well away from the refinement of Burt Goldblatt, what he was doing for so many labels. Prestige is still well behind the charts in the graphic design department. P139, it's going to put us probably into 53. So when we talk about a label showing up, what we're going to try to show you is their arrival on the scene, but also let it be known when they become kind of more significant. And we'll probably come back to some of these labels later on in the sequence and talk about what they're doing in a later era. And Prestige, of course, is a preeminent label out of New York doing this independent black jazz music through the early 50s into the mid 50s into the late 50s, and then they become the real proponent of soul jazz in the 60s. But Billy Taylor was a fantastic young player, along with Earl May and Charlie Smith. Fantastic stuff. Now we start getting into actual covers here, 165, and you're starting to see a graphic design now happening at Prestige, and we're probably into 54 here, I'm going to guess. But again, cool cover, great Billy Taylor playing, and there's a lot of great stuff being recorded at Prestige at this point. I mean, a glut of it, and a lot of it is going to show up, almost all of it actually, on LP. Another Billy Taylor trio record, kind of a worn cover, but you can see the 3 of them there. Charlie Smith, Earl May, number 168. And we're now approaching the LP era. This is a nice record of the great Charlie Mariano, Boston All-Stars. And I love Charlie Mariano, a great alto player. Plays a lot of ferocity and fire. He often worked with guys like Serge Chaloff. Played on the West Coast. I think he was in one of the Woody Herman groups for a while. His work on Bethlehem coming up is really fantastic. And that's, again, not great graphic design at 153. I think I actually showed that out of sequence there. And then Miles Davis here, All-Star Sextet with Lucky Thompson, J.J. Johnson, Horace Silver, Percy Heath, and Kenny Clark. And Clark's mostly a Savoy guy. Probably hasn't quite got to that point yet. Horace Silver's about to become a Blue Note guy. And this was number 182. And we're almost to the LP era at this point. And some of this stuff is going to definitely show up on LP in that later era. So that's kind of an idea of what Prestige was doing, how quickly they become a major force in terms of what's innovative in jazz, and not necessarily in sales, because I mean a lot of this stuff's going to be very regional, very under the mainstream, and it's like knowing the Wu-Tang and Nas well before they broke mainstream and years later with like Forever. If you knew Wu-Tang in 93, 94, that was well before anybody else knew who they were. And so these smaller labels are going to be putting out the undercurrent of jazz well before it hits the mainstream. And Weinstock definitely deserves a lot of credit for being ahead of that curve. So the next label I want to talk to you about is Atlantic Records. And Atlantic Records shows up in New York in 1949 as well. The great Ahmet Ertegun launches it. I believe he was a Turkish American. There was a guy by the name of Herb Abramson, who was kind of co-founding it with him, who ends up leaving and forms Jubilee, which we'll talk about in the next episode, because Jubilee doesn't really come into the fore jazz-wise till a little bit later. What they're doing early on isn't really jazz. But Atlantic's not necessarily just a jazz label, but they certainly end up issuing a lot of really important jazz by early 50s into the late 50s. Ornette Coleman, Change of the Century, John Coltrane's Giant Steps, My Favorite Things, Charlie Mingus's Picanthropus Erectus. There's so many important Atlantic recordings. And Atlantic doesn't really get on that cutting edge quite as quickly as, say, Weinstock at Prestige, and Ertegun ends up bringing his brother Neshui into the fold at some point. But early on, they're very much willing to record black artists, and they do end up having some important recordings in this 10-inch era. I don't have as many Atlantic 10 inches. You have Mae Barnes, who's an interesting singer. Cool cover, by the way. It almost looks like a Burt Goldblatt, but I don't think it is. All those pencil drawings of the people in the background. Great 50s graphic design there. The great Mabel Mercer. Again, it looks like a Burt Goldblatt. The Goldblatt, dude. It is a Burt Goldblatt. So he did some Atlantic covers as well. Goldblatt was everywhere in the early 50s. It's amazing how many labels he's actually making artwork for. Mabel Mercer, fantastic vocalist. Sidney Bechet. So again, a great... Bechet was really kind of omnipresent right now. He was really having a resurgence. The great Don Byas, who, if I recall, this was probably recorded in Europe and being licensed by Atlantic here, and that's I guess I knew that was Goldblatt. That's totally Goldblatt style right there. Everything about that screams Burt Goldblatt. And then Billy Taylor also shows up here at Atlantic, and some of this stuff's going to be reissued on LP, and Atlantic ends up really hitting their stride in 55, 56, and then they're soon to launch the 8000 sequence, and the 1200 sequence with Atlantic and the LP era is the jazz sequence with some incredible titles. The 8000 sequence is more the pop, rhythm, and blues stuff, where you get your Ray Charles and Aretha Franklins and all that stuff. And both sequences are really quite insane, really wonderful, documenting a lot of great African American music. And Atlantic deserves a lot of credit. And while they certainly don't put out the glut of stuff that Weinstock does in this early era, Atlantic's certainly a label of note, one worth keeping your eye on. And when you see old material from them, it's not going to be bad. Even if you don't know much about it, it's not going to be bad stuff. So next label I'll talk to you about, again, launches in 48, 49, I believe 49, is Roost. And this is the aforementioned Teddy Reig, who we talked about in the last episode, who was a strong proponent of bringing the black music into Herman Lubinsky at Savoy. They end up having a falling out, and he goes his own direction and launches the Royal Roost, or just the Roost label. The Royal Roost was a club in New York that he spent a lot of time around. He wasn't really affiliated with, if I recall, but he certainly was around that circle in that neighborhood, and was a real person with his ear to the streets. Like I said, a real hustler, kind of a short, diminutive fellow, but certainly a heavy set fella. I think he was near 300 pounds. But Reig had a good ear for what was happening. He knew how to put a lineup together of musicians. He was one that would listen to his musicians, and if so-and-so said they wanted these people on his session, he would do his best to get them for him. Everything I've ever read about Teddy Reig, he was a real musician's kind of promoter, producer. And so when he launches Roost, he gets a lot of cream of the crop artists, and he does filter some stuff off from Savoy and brings them over to Roost. And he records some insane stuff here. in the early 50s up into 57, 58 when Roost got to getting bought by Roulette and distributed by Roulette, which we'll talk about a couple episodes down the road. But the Roost legacy is really an impressive legacy. I'm going to show you their 50s 10-inch stuff, which I actually have all of this stuff. Bud Powell, 401. So right off the bat, you're starting with some pretty heavy hitting there. Stan Getz. Again, you can see the difference in graphic design here in the early 50s. Georgie Auld, the tenor player I talked about a couple back on Prestige, I think it was. We talked about him briefly. Stan Getz, Volume 2. Again, the covers are not leave a lot to be desired here. James Moody, a fantastic tenor player who was a very gospel kind of infused soul player. He had a big hit with Moody's Mood, is it? I think it might be Moody's Mood, actually. Roger Guerin's on this. Pierre Michelot's on the bass. Pierre Lamarchand's on the drum. This might have been recorded in France by the sounds of that. And then here we go, number 406, Billy Taylor at Storyville, which is a club in Boston. You can see here that that's a Goldblatt cover. And that's classic Burt Goldblatt, probably 52, maybe 53 already. The time goes by so fast on these labels in terms of a lot of them kind of start kind of slow and they start to build up. 407 is Stan Getz at Storyville. And I'm guessing this is probably before George Wein launches the Storyville label, which I think we'll talk about that later in this episode, actually. Kai Winding, All-Stars, a great Danish bone player, a fantastic Goldblatt cover. And Goldblatt, more than obviously David So Martin, probably more than anybody, is the real template for what graphic design in jazz looks like. And even Reed Miles, to some degree, is going to have some influences coming from Kai Winding's stylings. Burt Goldblatt's stylings. Great cover, Billy Taylor again. He was pretty omnipresent in jazz at this point. He shows up at so many labels. The great Johnny Smith, great Burt Goldblatt cover. This is from an NBC recording, Jazz at NBC on the radio. Eddie Safransky, Don Lamont, and Sanford Gold. And Sanford Gold actually makes a cool record at Prestige, which is really hard to find. But again, classic Goldblatt, got Getz and Smith. And by the time the LP era comes along, Johnny Smith is kind of like the bulwark of what Roost becomes. Stan Getz shows up again here, Jazz at Storyville Volume 2. Another classic Burt Goldblatt cover. Interesting color coordinations. The pink with the kind of goldish mustard color. That's the Roost, classic Royal Roost label. More classic Bud Powell. And so a lot of this stuff's going to be coupled on the LP when we get to that sequence, which I think was a 2200 sequence or the 1200 sequence. So a lot of stuff will be reissued on LP when that LP series dawns. But what a great cover that is with Powell. Goldblatt kind of captures him and does that split color, which again is reminiscent of what Reed Miles is going to do at Blue Note, not too much further down the road here. That feels like a Reed Miles cover in some ways. Again, the big font, sans serif fonts, the Johnny Smith drawing in the middle. You can't help but see some of the influence that Goldblatt immerses people like Reed Miles in. And Reed Miles wasn't even a jazz guy, but he still must have seen what Goldblatt was doing. Classic cover here, Dizzy Gillespie in Paris. I think this was probably licensed from a French label. Vocals by Joe Carroll, who has some cool recordings of his own. Dizzy kind of floating over the city. Just a great cover. And the sound starts getting better and better in this era. Here's some great Sonny Stitt, number 415. Just cool the way the font is set up and the photograph and the exclamation point. It's all, again, very reminiscent of stuff that you're going to see become preeminent everywhere in jazz down the road. The original Lee Konitz again. So again, we see Roost here is really at the forefront in this era in terms of recording some of the most important people. There's some Parker recordings that get issued, which I think were probably done initially as 78s, possibly. I'm not sure, but he does issue a lot of Parker stuff on the LP era. Stan Getz, one of the weirder covers Goldblatt does. I think it was with Johnny Smith again on the guitar. It looks like a Christmas record, doesn't it? The color and the font and all that. Uh, Fantastic Sonny Stitt. What a great cover that is. Beautiful graphic design. Beautiful, really eye-catching colors. Stitt was a fucking fiery young player. The lone wolf, he called him, because he never really had a working band. He just worked with whoever would show up and record with them, played at clubs with different bands all the time. Never really established one crew. Piano Mama was Eddie Bonamere. Eddie Bonamere was a Harlem piano player who kind of really slipped into obscurity. Fantastic gold black graphic design. Again, you see some Reed Miles being impacted by some of these covers. The street corners there of Lenox on 140th Street. And Bonamere ends up being kind of deeply immersed in the church. And if I recall, he actually was a Catholic, if I remember. And he does some spiritual stuff that was kind of elements of jazz, but a lot of more gospel, even European composition. And he ends up recording some pretty interesting stuff later down the road that people in jazz wouldn't really know or follow. But Bonamere was certainly an interesting player, Eddie Bonamere. Stan Getz quintets at Storyville once again with Al Haig, Jimmy Rainey, Teddy Kotick, and Tiny Khan. So Getz is a fairly preeminent figure here for both Prestige and Roost. More Johnny Smith, great Burnt Gold Black cover. So you see Roost has a pretty big body of work. I got 2 copies of that. There's Eddie Lockjaw Davis, who is probably, this is probably after his time. No, it's probably before his time at King. So he does a recording here for these guys, for Roost. Then he goes to King and makes probably 5 records there, and then shows up at Prestige where he ends up for a long time. Split Kick, another great cover, split, color-wise. Again, you see the influence of what's happening modernity-wise with Gold Black. And then another Johnny Roost session, Sir Johnny Smith session. So Roost is really one of the most important labels of the early 50s. More important than Blue Note, more important than, I mean, Savoy's still doing some great stuff without question. Prestige is definitely making an impact on the scene. When it comes to the New York labels, though, that was happening. Riverside's yet to arrive, Bethlehem's yet to arrive, Atlantic's still kind of getting their way, Blue Note's still kind of getting their way. Prestige, Roost, and Savoy really the kind of cats me out at this point. So next I want to dive into some of the West Coast labels that were coming to the fore at this point. First we're going to start with Fantasy, which launches by Soul and something otherwise, the Weiss brothers. Do I have it? It should be written here. Saul and Max Weiss, a couple of Jews out in the Bay Area, and they co-launched this label with a young Dave Brubeck. And Brubeck does a ton of recordings for Fantasy at this era, in the early 50s up into his departure for Columbia down the road, when he realizes that his ownership only included his parts of recordings and not all the other stuff on that Fantasy was doing, which was not what he agreed to. But Brubeck is really a huge part of the success of Fantasy early on. And Fantasy is the same label, like I think I mentioned in the last episode, that ends up being Creedence Clearwater in '68. So, I mean, that kind of saved their hide at that point. But more Dave Brubeck Octet. Interesting graphic design here. I don't remember who does the graphic here, but it's cool stuff. Fantasy does a lot of work with Brubeck. And the other big proponent was a guy by the name of Cal Jader, who we'll talk about more later. But see, all these Brubecks are showing up here. That's 4 of the first 7 titles. More Brubeck at number 11, Jazz at Oberlin. Again, a lot of this stuff's going to be reissued on LP. Jazz at the College of the Pacific. It's pretty crazy how much Brubeck is being issued by this label. But again, he's part owner. Cal Jader Trio. And it's great cover, great graphic design on that. Really speaks from the era that it is. Really a fan of that cover. It's number 3-9. They do a lot of colored vinyl at Fantasy, which is kind of fun. Red Norvo, the fantastic vibraphonist. Here's a cool session by him. Interesting graphics once again. So Fantasy has a pretty cool graphic department. That was number 312. Number 3-14 is Nat Pierce, who's a pianist who works at times with the Herd, Woody Herman, and I think she actually worked as for a while with Basie's group at one point, but that was much later on. But Pierce has some cool recordings. He has a cool recording at, I think it's not bad. Storyville maybe. Cool stuff. Gold black cover, but cool stuff here. So Fantasy does some cool stuff here in the early 50s, and Brubeck's departure, I'm sure, definitely hurt Fantasy when he does leave in 56 or so. But then in LA, there was two labels that kind of come along. First in 49. 52. You had Pacific show up, and Pacific is a fantastic label formed by Roy Hart and Richard Bach, and those two guys start doing the West Coast cool. Mulligan's a big proponent of that. Mulligan, of course, was the driving force behind the birth of the cool sessions that Miles Davis gets all the credit for today. But Mulligan was really, that was his vehicle. And so Mulligan signs with Pacific, and you can see a young, the drummer, what's his name? I just had to tip my tongue and now I lost it. Chico Hamilton. But Mulligan's a really interesting player. He plays the baritone. A great composer, one of the great composers in jazz of that era, one of the best arrangers in that era, a great player without question, and a real driving force. A lot of the direction, recognizing the black innovation, but kind of crystallizing it and making it his own. Here's again Lee Konitz, a fantastic young alto player from New York, showing up on the West Coast. And Konitz is kind of one of the proponents of the cool. And of course, we can't not forget Paul Desmond, who was playing a lot with Brubeck back at the Fantasy stuff, more during Mulligan stuff. So you see the cool starts to really come in the fore here in 52, 53, 54. This is Russ Freeman, a fantastic young piano player who dies sadly very young. Shelly Manne and Joe Mondragon on that. Chet Baker. Baker shows up now, and again, he's kind of one of the epitomes of the West Coast cool. And Baker has a lot of recordings for Pacific Records. And Chet Baker, along with Bill Evans, have some of the most collectible jazz recorded by white musicians from this era. Here's Konitz and Mulligan together. And again, this stuff will all be reissued on the LP era when that launches. Here's the great Bud Shank, who played alto, he played flute, he plays clarinet. Shank's a very, very multi-instrumentalist, fantastic talent. He's playing with 3 trombones. Is it Jay and Kai in this? Who are the bone players? Maynard Ferguson's on this. Bob Envelson's on this. Wow. Bob Cooper's on this. Looks like Shelly Manne, maybe. Stu Williams is on the trumpet. Am I the only showing one of the bone players? Anyway, great Bud Shank. Pacific's art department is kind of more in this vein. Here's Clifford Brown showing up on the West Coast, probably in 53, 54. Fantastic young Clifford Brown, dynamic, fiery. It's not quite what he's going to be doing later on with Max Roach, but it's still young Clifford in his development phase. He was a young kid coming out of school, changing the face of jazz. He was playing with Zoot Sims, Russ Freeman, Shelly Manne, Joe Mondragon, a few other players as well, Bobby Gordon, Stu Williamson, Carson Smith on the bass. No, Joe on drums, sorry. But yeah, it's fantastic, Clifford Brown. And this also was repackaged on LP, of course. Johnny Holiday sings, and then Kitty White sings. These are singer records. And these are 800s, 801, 802, which is a bit of a separate sequence than the other Pacific stuff I was showing you there. And then the other label that shows up on the West Coast here is Contemporary. And Contemporary was formed by Lester Koenig. And Contemporary forms in 52, if I remember. And they bring a glut of fantastic West Coast stuff to the forefront, starting with the Shelly Manne stuff, and then the great bass player who has all those Live at the Lighthouse sessions. Oh, I can't think of his name right now. I gotta think of it. Howard Rumsey. Howard Rumsey makes all these recordings for Contemporary. A lot of them Live at the Lighthouse, which is a club on the beach in the LA area, and a lot of those sessions feature some fantastic musicians from Max Roach to Miles Davis to just a huge list of who's who showed up at those clubs, and Contemporary records that. The Rumsey stuff gets issued as 10-inch, it gets repackaged as LP eventually. Some of the stuff I do have here, and I don't have enough of the Contemporary 10-inch stuff. It's kind of expensive and not as easy to come by. That's actually some Lighthouse All-Star stuff right there. There's Rumsey on the cover. Cool Lighthouse cover. I think this is red vinyl as well, if I recall. Yeah. So the red vinyl was a pretty common thing, especially on the West Coast labels. You had fantastic guys like Barney Kessel recording for Contemporary, and Kessel, of course, one of the great guitar players, ends up a big member of the Wrecking Crew and one of the fantastic session guys. Howard Rumsey, again, Lighthouse All-Stars. And then here you have, I think it's Shelly Manne. This cover is kind of weird, wrapped in plastic, hard to read. But there's the Contemporary label that we know, but that was the early label. And there's really a fantastic collection of stuff that Contemporary does in the 10-inch era, which again will all be issued on the LP era once again. So these West Coast labels, those three especially, are really strong proponents of the West Coast cool and are helping drive the sales of the band members from the Herman and Kenton groups, and really pushing jazz into the youth of America. Even though R&B was kind of starting to take over, these records still sold pretty well compared to their Black East Coast counterparts. So the next label I'll talk to you about doesn't have the legacy of Contemporary, Fantasy, and Pacific, nor of course the West Coast, East Coast labels like Atlantic, Blue Note, Prestige, Savoy. But this label certainly was important in this time frame. We're talking early 50s. It was launched by a guy named Albert Marks, I believe it was. Yeah, Albert Marks, launched in 48. Starts off in Hollywood, ends up having a New York office as well. And not all these names are going to be as familiar as the names we've been talking, but there's some really important recordings here on Discovery. And Savoy ends up buying the Discovery label, and Albert Marks resurfaces again later in the mid-50s with the Trend label. But we'll show you some of the stuff Discovery does. And this is, again, a complete discography here of what the 10-inch stuff at Discovery was. And again, Burt Goldblatt ends up being a huge part of this graphic design. Panorama of British Jazz. The 2000 sequence here, 2001, this is going to be a different sequence than their main sequence, and we'll show you that here in a minute. Excuse me. Vic Lewis, Johnny Dankworth, Ronnie Scott, Ronnie Ball. I mean, that's some fantastic stuff. Ronnie Ball has a session at Savoy. Ronnie Scott, of course, is one of the famous British players. Tough to come by 10-inch right there. Jazz from Sweden on Discovery. And if I remember, this one wasn't even on Discogs when I first found it. It's presented by Sidney Gross, B.B. Johns, Sten Karlberg, Rolf Berg. So you have some of the same guys that were on the Prestige session from Sweden. So you can see the impact of this black music as it's sweeping the world. Jerry Wiggins on the 2000 sequence, who was a pretty famous West Coast piano player. And that's a gold-black cover for sure with the line drawing there. Jimmy Duker, who, if I remember, was Scottish, not British, but Scottish. But he was a great trumpet player, a pretty big showcase in the European UK scene. He has a record at Contemporary not long after this, but kind of disappears from the American scene at that point. Hans Kohler was a German player. So why the Wiggins stuff ends up in this sequence is weird, because most of these are imported stuff. Swedish Pastry, Rolf Eriksson. Again, Eriksson was on Prestige. You'll also have a session coming up at Emersy in like 54, 55. Then again, Roy and Zut, number 2009. Classic Burt Goldblatt cover and design there. Beautiful stuff. Roy Eldridge, fiery young trumpet player from all the swing years. And Zut's the fantastic tenor player. And then 2010, The Isles of Jazz. This is more stuff from Britain. Cool cover. I don't think that's a Goldblatt though. But use of pink. Discovery seems to use quite a bit of pink for some reason. Then they move on to the 3000 sequence here. And this is Calvin Jackson. If I remember, it's from the DC area. Tonal expression. And this is kind of a combination of cool, third stream, modern, definitely post-bebop already. So the bebop movement's already kind of subdued. The cool movement's really taken over. Hard bop hasn't really crystallized itself yet. George Shearing, another Brit, shows up here. Interesting cover. This guy who does this artwork, whose name I can't recall, he does quite a bit of graphic design and jazz in this small window as well in the early 50s. Dancers in Love, Ike Carpenter Orchestra. So again, a name that's fairly obscure today. But Phil Moore, a fantastic piano player. Why they have the pan flutist on there, I'm not really sure. not a gold-black cover. Again, the red vinyl, which was pretty preeminent on the West Coast. More Phil Moore at the piano. Cool cover there. That could be a gold-black, actually. I'm to the point where I see a gold-black cover, I pretty much will grab it. And then you see that pan fluter again here on, this is a Georgie Auld, that great tenor player I was speaking about. Dixie for Dancing, Ben Pollock's Pick a Rib Boys. And this gets repackaged at Savoy, Ben Pollock's Pick a Rib Boys. Cool. Pink. Once again, a lot of pink here. It's like pink was like new to graphic design. Again, that stupid pan flute in the background there. Paul Smith Quartet. And Paul Smith is a piano player that backs Ella Fitzgerald for a long time. He makes a lot of recordings for Capitol. Some fantastic stuff over there. Cool cover. Goldblatt for sure. Martha Ray. You could see Reed Miles having some influence from Goldblatt once again there. Marianne McCall, a great singer who again shows up at Savoy later on. I think she also has some work at Jubilee, if I remember. But cool Discovery recordings. There's the Discovery label. So Albert Marks really has his finger and pulse on both the black and the white side of things. Red Norvo Trio, the young vibraphonist who's showing up in a lot of places at this time. Dizzy Gillespie, Johnny Richards conducts, and Richards, if I remember, was an arranger for Stan Kenton at times. What a cool cover that is. I don't think that's a Goldblatt, but cool Gillespie. And Gillespie really has his fingers on a lot of pies at this point. This is Johnny Green, songs by Johnny Green, sorry, by Johnny Richards Orchestra. So again, he was a conductor and arranger of the big band scene. And Zoot Sims, which is a weird interloping cover here because of this time frame. Why would they go back to something so simple? But Zoot Sims, Jerry Wiggins, Kenny Clark, and Pierre Michelot. So probably recorded in France. Not, oh, yeah, it says recorded in France right there. Number 3015. So Discovery continues here with more Paul Smith, the great piano player, who's a very elegant, light touch. Red Norval Volume 2. Interesting cover graphic there. And a couple of really heavy hitters now. Art Pepper. Art Pepper has some good sessions here in 53, 54 for Discovery. And these end up at Savoy as that surf ride and maybe one other session as well. Eddie Burt, who shows up at Savoy like the following year and wins Trombone Player of the Year and puts out a couple of really good recordings at Savoy. Here's Burt as a younger man here for Discovery. That was probably recorded in the New York office. Beryl Booker, one of the fantastic female piano players of this era. She has a lot of cool recordings, some at Emersy, other places as well, along with Elaine Layton on the drums and Bonnie Wetzel on the bass. So you have an all-girl trio right there. Beryl Booker with the great Don Bias in Paris. So obviously she went overseas and recorded with Don, who was over there. And Don was a legend who kind of has slipped into obscurity today. Art Pepper, number 3023, fantastic West Coast fiery. I mean, Pepper's really just a cool guy. Pepper's a real fiery player, bad drug problem. And the Canadian All-Stars 3025 wraps up the Discovery 10-inch sequence. So it's a pretty extensive body of work that Discovery does here, 52, 53, 54, 55. And as the LP era kind of dawns, he sells that stuff off, mostly to Savoy, it seems like. And like I said, he resurfaces with Trend Label, which I'll cover in the next episode. So I mentioned Jubilee earlier. It was a label founded by Herb Abramson, who had worked with Ahmet Ertegun at Atlantic. They had a separate going of ways. And he kind of starts Jubilee in 47. And it's not all jazz to begin with whatsoever. Songs his mother never taught him. I mean, it's not really jazz whatsoever. But eventually he does get to some jazz titles. And a lot of it's kind of Dixieland kind of oriented at first. It's not really till 57 where they get some really heavy jazz hitters. But Stan Rubin, the Territorial Five. Again, kind of New Orleans-y stuff. The Salt City Five. And Goldblatt does do covers here, so that's one of the interesting things about this. Polly Bergen, who was an interesting singer from that era. I think she was also a stage presence. I think she did some acting. If I remember, she's the same gal that shows up in that one Tony Sopranos episode. as one of his dad's old mistresses, old Polly Bergen at that point. This Betty St. Clair record's really fantastic. A young black woman that can really sing, and you can see the Burt Goldblatt stylings on that. And then Salt City 5, again, Burt Goldblatt to a T right there. And Jubilee doesn't really get its impact for a few years, but they're worth throwing in there just to show you where they kind of arrived. So next label I want to talk to you about out of Boston is Storyville. And we mentioned Storyville briefly in the Roost sequence where we talked about some of those recordings being at Storyville, which was a club in Boston run by George Wein. And Wein probably saw the success Roost was having with some of those recordings. He ends up launching his own imprint called Storyville, named after the club. And this is the same as George Wein that ends up promoting the Providence, Rhode Island, Newport Jazz Festival. That's the same George Wein. But from 53, 52 to 57 or so, he has a label at Storyville that does some really good recordings. And so they show up in 52, and they started with some Sidney Bechet. So again, we're seeing Bechet show up in a lot of different venues here. Probably once again licensed, I'm guessing, although it does say Jazz at Storyville. So maybe that was recorded live there, I'm not sure. Here's Teddy King with Beryl Booker, the piano player we just mentioned. Here she shows up again with Teddy King, one of the great singers of this era. That's definitely a gold-black cover, if I remember. Cool stuff. Pink, once again, seems to be coming into prominence. Jazz at Storyville, George Wein Storyville Band. This is going to be pretty rooted in Dixieland swing stuff. Edmund Hall, Vic Dickinson, Ruby Braff, Johnny Windhurst, Joe Jones. So kind of a real classic throwback look here. Then we have Lee Konitz, Jazz at Storyville. Again, a lot of this stuff was probably recorded right in the club and put on the vinyl and put out there for people to consume. There's actually a European Vogue version of that. See, that's Vogue, and it's a French label, if I remember. And this is the Storyville label, and that's their logo. Konitz is quite a bit. Bob Brookmeyer, the young trombone player, who does some work for Clef in the same window. I think that comes first. That's with Al Cohn, the great tenor player. Sidney Bechet, Volume 2. It's probably a gold-black cover, I'm guessing. More gold-black here, Jazz at Storyville, Mahogany Hall, All-Stars, and the Joe Jones Quartet. Great cover. All those line drawings by the great Burt Goldblatt. Pee Wee Russell, a great clarinetist. Again, very much in the Dixieland tradition. But these guys could probably draw pretty well, which is partly why Wein was probably booking them. And Boston's a very white town, very Irish Catholic, very traditional. So bringing in the kind of more older school guys probably makes some sense, although he does dive into some modernity coming up. The Songs of Delinquency are sung by Shep Ganandes. And this is a bit more of a folk entry, pop culture thing. Serge Chaloff and Boots Mazzulli. I love Serge Chaloff, the great baritone player. Sadly, a drug problem, dies very young. The great Russ Freeman shows up in as well. And Boots Mazzulli is a fantastic tenor player. I'd like to find an old copy of that someday. Jazz at the Boston Arts Festival. Again, a great Burt Goldblatt cover. Some fantastic players, kind of a compilation. Lee Wiley, Songs of Rodgers and Hart. Again, that classic Goldblatt kind of one cover monochromatic kind of look. Lee Konitz, fantastic, just photography, probably somewhere on the Atlantic shore there off the coast of Boston, Cape Cod maybe off of Gloucester, I'm not sure, but just great photography. And that really stands out from the earlier soulless covers that were being put out in the early 50s and of course in the 78 RPM era. Teddy King, singer we talked about with Beryl Booker, here she is on her own, gold-black cover. Rudy Valentine's Drinking Songs, again, more in a folk tradition there, which again, this stuff is going to be interchangeable at times. Ellis Larkin, another fantastic piano player, I think out of New York. Cool cover of them there, kind of between those sound barriers. Beautiful, beautiful layout, beautiful photography with the color of the green. Serge Chaloff, The Fable of Mabel, fantastic Boston baritone player who ends up part of the West Coast scene in one of the Woody Herman herds. Wild Bill, Pee Wee, and Vic, some more New Orleans kind of stuff. Joe Newman, the fantastic bassy trumpet alumni, he gets some recording here. Ruby Braff, the aforementioned trumpet player, who plays largely modern post-Dixieland, but with Dixieland influences. Jackie and Roy, very young, that singing duo. And then Lee Konitz and Harvard Square, more fantastic Lee Konitz. So that's what Storyville put out in the early 50s. Again, a very fantastic documentation of a lot of modern with some Dixieland thrown in, which was selling well. You can see the difference between the labels that were more focused on white demographic, like Pacific and Contemporary and Storyville, versus the labels that were more focused on the African American artists. There's quite a difference there. Now we're going to dive into two small labels that didn't last long, both brought to you by musicians, which tells you something about what they were trying to accomplish. Again, we have gold black covers here, but Dizzy Gillespie launches a label in 52, I believe it was, 51. And Joe Carroll shows up in this, Freddie Strong, Melvin Moore, Percy Heath, Art Blakey, Kenny Burrell, Sam Smith. Some really great players, Milt Jackson, a young John Coltrane even showed up with some of this because he was playing in Gillespie's big band for a while. Interesting cover, that's not a gold black, but still interesting cover. DG number 1000, 10-inch 51. And then number 1001, this is Bill Russo, another fantastic West Coast producer, arranger, works with, I believe it was Herman, maybe it was Kenton, but Shelley Davis is on this. Fantastic stuff. Cool cover. And then a great gold black cover here is Milt Jackson, Detroit alumni to Dizzy. This is a great gold black cover for sure. Fantastic vibraphonist with Kenny Clark, Ray Brown, and John Lewis. So some pretty high pedigree stuff there. Then this is Shelly Mann Septet, playing with Art Pepper, Joe Mondragon, Bobby Gordon, Jimmy Joffrey, Conti Candoli, Shorty Rogers, Bobby Cooper. Some pretty fantastic stuff. Great cover by Goldblatt. And then Dizzy Gillespie, Volume 2. Cool cover once again. And Gillespie did realize that that side of the business wasn't what he wanted to really do. And Savoy ends up owning all those titles and issues a lot of that stuff as School Days and a few other Savoy titles. The issue, the Milt Jackson, the reissue. I think pretty much all that gets reissued by Savoy. And then Charlie Mingus launches a label in, I believe, 52 called Debut. And Mingus, of course, a difficult person, decided to have his own label, have his own little artistic freedom. Here's some jazz workshop stuff. And if you remember, there's some Savoy jazz workshop stuff as well. J.J. Johnson, Kai Winding, Benny Green, Willie Dennis. I have Volume 2 of that as well, if I recall. Yep. Slightly different color tonation there. There's some really good stuff on Canada Jazz at Massey Hall. And that's one of the real important sessions that comes out is the Jazz at Massey Hall stuff, which is a great group with Max Roach, Charlie Parker, Charlie Mingus, Dizzy Gillespie, if I remember. I mean, what a group. Yeah, Parker, Gillespie, Powell, Roach, and Mingus. And that's recorded at Massey Hall in my hometown in Toronto. Cool cover. Don't know who does that. But Arnold Muggs, it looks like. And then Thad Jones, the young bass and trumpet player. This predates the stuff at Blue Note. There's a number of cool debut titles. And Debut's not long for this world. Mingus eventually sells it to Fantasy, the West Coast label with the Weiss Brothers. And Fantasy reissues almost all of the Debut stuff, a lot of it with different covers. The Debut stuff also gets reissued on LP by Debut and then eventually by Fantasy as well with different covers. So the Debut discography is very convoluted and very hard to keep straight. And Debut 10 inches aren't cheap. They're pretty tough to come by and expensive, in part because Mingus' name is associated with them. But great stuff all the same. So a few more small labels I want to show you guys real quickly. It was such an interesting time in music. I mean, the post-war years was blossoming, but there was still a great deal of oppression and racism. Leonard Feather, the young music critic and entrepreneur, helps launch a label called Period. And Period, it wasn't launched by him, but he was brought in to kind of manage. Bill Avar founds the label. But Feather was brought in, I believe in 51, Feather comes into the Period Foundation. And there's some interesting stuff here. Some of this is going to be on LP. Maxine Sullivan and Charlie Shaver singing Loch Lomond, which was a famous Scottish kind of folk song that they reinterpret. Woody and you, Al Haig. Haig was a kind of a bebop piano player. Some interesting stuff here that isn't really jazz, flamenco. But here's some Ralph Burns, which is a little bit more jazz. Another one of those compilation label records, because some of the stuff would have been from early 50s. Here's the Al Haig Quartet. This was initially a 10-inch. A lot of the stuff's on LP because it's hard to find. More Al Haig. So Period was doing some interesting stuff under the guidance of Leonard Feather, Django Reinhardt, probably licensed from Europe. There's the Period logo. More Django Reinhardt Volume 2. Sonny Rollins, a very early Rollins session here, shows up under the tutelage of Leonard Feather. Maxine Sullivan, who I just spoke about, was one of the great singers of the mid-swing Depression era, a huge influence on singers like Ella Fitzgerald. Maxine Sullivan really has kind of been forgotten. It's more Maxine. But here's Mad Thad. Thad Jones again showing up in 53, 54 here. So he gets that record we just saw on debut. Here he shows up on Period under Leonard Feather. And then shortly after this, 55 or so, Period sells their jazz titles, including some Mingus stuff like East Coasting, to Bethlehem. So those get reissued on Bethlehem with different covers. So Period was an important label for a brief period. Another label that shows up in this period is Progressive, under the name of a guy, Gus Statiris. And not a lot of stuff here as well. They kind of came and went quickly, but the Italian immigrant George Wallington, who was a fashionista, thus the name Wallington. His kids called him that in school. Max Roach, Curly Russell, and George Wallington, a nice trio session. And again, who's the cover? Burt Goldblatt. 3002 was Al Cohn, the great tenor player, again, who was playing a lot of those West Coast Woody Herman groups. More Al Cohn, more Burt Goldblatt artwork. And the young guitar player Chuck Wayne, who ends up writing a book on guitar playing and some interesting chordal ideas. Wayne becomes a very influential person that people who study guitar theory will almost always come to that book. Hal Steen and Warren Fitzgerald. That's a LP now, and this is number 1002. Number 1001 was George Wallington at the Bohemia. So these were LPs. The first four were 10 inches. And then Progressive disappears, only to resurface years later under completely different ownership and management and a completely different direction. The last thing I'm going to show you in this episode is Imperial. And we talked about Imperial briefly in last episode in regards to them being the ones who bought Aladdin and ended up owning that. It was founded by a guy by the name of Lou Chudd in like 46 or 7. Imperial comes on the scene. And Imperial is Lou Chudd 47. And Imperial is doing jump blues and pop stuff and just a wide range of stuff. Here's an early 10-inch by Charlie Ventura, the Philly tenor player. Pretty tough stuff to come by. And Imperial does a wide range of stuff, not a ton of jazz, some Charlie Mariano stuff, which is a Japanese reissuing of what I believe was a 10-inch initially. And again, it looks like a Goldblatt cover, doesn't it? And then Imperial kind of becomes known for more rhythm and blues, but they do these great Sonny Chris titles in 55 and 56. Wild Bill Davis was an organ player. More Sonny Chris. Sonny Chris plays Cole Porter. This is Paul Smith, the aforementioned piano player. And by now we're in the late 50s, but I'm just kind of showing you some of the Imperial stuff that's out there. Teach Me Tiger, which is kind of fun, loungy stuff. This is Coleman Hawkins, Howard McGee, Lester Young. Day with Greatness. I think young Miles Davis even shows up on this. But the session's actually from the late 40, 47. And gets repackaged here on LP much later on Imperial. More Wild Bill Davis. Harold Land Quintet. This is after he left Clifford Brown, Max Roach. And then Big J McNeely. This is a compilation of earlier Imperial sides. And Imperial, like I said, was very much rooted in that jump blues, rhythm and blues, with some jazz stuff sprinkled in. But they're important to remember, to recognize. There's some good titles out there. And again, they bought the Aladdin score intro stuff that includes Jazz West. So you gotta recognize Imperial for its part of this legacy. This episode's an hour long. We're gonna wrap it up there. Hope you enjoy the channel. Please help support it. Go to my Patreon, go to my YouTube thanks, PayPal, whatever you want to do. Help support this channel so we can keep spreading this gospel of this music. It's an incredible legacy seeing these labels show up and what they contribute to the scene. Next episode, we're going to talk about the next chapter of the early 50s, 53, 54, 55. Good stuff. Talk to you all soon. Peace.